Hello and welcome to Philosophy Podcasts. I'm August Baker, and today I'm speaking with Professor Peter E. Gordon to talk about his book, Walter Benjamin. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, I was looking over your previous books, the list of previous books. Is this your first time you've done a biography?
Yes, definitely.
And how was that? I'm imagining that the advantage of doing a biography would be maybe somebody I haven't read all of their things or don't know them too well, and so this will give me a chance to read everything and make my own opinions. Is that what this was like for you?
Yeah. Well, I should say that I've operated in the general field of Frankfurt School critical theory for some time now, though I've written a great deal more about Theodor Adorno. I've written a bit about Habermas and some of the others, but Benjamin has always been more of a challenge for me. My own manner of thinking is perhaps more rationalist than his, and he's a thinker who's highly inclined toward metaphor, and those metaphors sometimes trip me up a little bit.
Oh,
They lead me into ways of thinking that aren't perhaps natural for me. But I found writing about him really of interest in part because a biography, I found myself stretching my skills with a genre that isn't typical for me,
hmm,
and it permitted me, particularly the skills of literary nonfiction. I mean, but Benjamin, because he is such a literary and metaphorical writer, encourages us when we're reading him to think in more literary terms. And although I don't think I naturally inclined toward those skills, it was a real joy for me to stretch myself a bit and to see if I could write in a way that honored in some respects his own literary sensitivities, his own gift for metaphor, and his own gift for literary experimentation. So one of the things I permitted myself to do in this book was think in a more literary and perhaps nonlinear fashion. The book is composed with some rather strange gestures that play with chronology here and there, in part because I wanted to honor Benjamin's own conflicted attitude about linear temporality. So, yeah, it was a real pleasure to read and an experiment for me. I don't know whether I believe I would ever return to the genre of
hmm,
biography.
hmm.
Inhabiting another thinker's mind completely may not be entirely suitable for someone whose main interest is philosophical analysis and the rational assessment of ideas. But it was a real pleasure nonetheless.
Right. Well, it is I think it does feel like a work of art, what you did. I, so you talk about rationalist versus metaphoric. I wanted to, and you've mentioned that the book, Three Rings had been inspiring
Yeah,
to you.
yeah,
Uh, he talks in there, I don't know if this is the same thing, but he talks in there about one type of narrativity, which is trying to make everything clear and no ambiguity, and another
mhm,
which is about shadows and interpretation. Is that the
yeah.
same thing or is that different?
Well, the little book by Daniel Mendelsohn,
Yeah.
called Three Rings, which was published by New York Review Books, is partly a biographical study and autobiographical study, but it's also Mendelssohn's very erudite meditation on a classical method of composition which shows up in Homer's work. And the metaphor of rings involves circling around or permitting oneself digressions. The digressions are often introduced by a particular phrase. You come to the end of the digression and you sew it up, you suture it closed by repeating that phrase that began the digression. Now, I decided not to make extensive use of this method
You
in the
did
book?
use it a little bit.
A little bit, but
Yeah.
if I used it too much, I would just lose readers, and I did want the book to be fairly accessible. Mendelssohn's description of it is extraordinary, and he meditates on the life of Erich Auerbach, who was also a refugee from Germany like Benjamin, so there was a connection there.
Born in the same year, by the way, 1892, I
That's
noticed.
very interesting, I did not know that.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Let's see, where was I?
Oh, I
Sorry.
was just wondering when you contrasted rationalist versus metaphoric, whether that was the same, because it seemed to me there was in his when he talked about Auerbach and he talked about there's this, well, I guess he called it Homeric and then Hebraic, I think. That
Mm,
one method was about making everything very, very clear, and
yeah.
another method was about, no, you leave a lot of things out, and that's richer.
Y Yes, I certainly do that, and without I don't want to I don't want to exaggerate how much I appeal to Mendelssohn's own recommendations here. I mean, his book is extraordinarily interesting to me and was very inspiring, but I made very, very economic use
Okay.
of his particular methods. I would say just in general, what I was trying to do was permit the book to um, develop and touch upon metaphors, images, particularly images of water that I felt were particularly of interest in Benjamin's own work.
Mhm.
And it's definitely true that I touch upon them in a very gentle way without pushing them too hard. And in that respect, yes, I think I did leave a great deal out. I mean, many people will notice right away that the book is rather spare. It moves rather quickly through Benjamin's whole career, and scholars of Benjamin and biographers of Benjamin have spilt a great deal more ink on the details of his life and literature than I did
Right.
this book. I mean, the really extraordinary accomplishment, which was published some years ago, was by Michael Jennings and Howard Island, who wrote a book called Walter Benjamin, A Critical Life, published by Harvard University Press, which is, by my lights, just a superb accomplishment. And mine is a very slight, modest accomplishment, but it's trying to do something, of course, rather different.
Right.
I'm not trying to be comprehensive. The economical inquiry into his life and work is meant to produce something that's more accessible and perhaps more literary in its style.
Right. Well, I think it did exactly what I like an intellectual biography to do, which is you introduce a lot of his texts, and so it gives the reader a sense of what is out there, and now because I'd heard about Walter Benjamin a lot, but I'd never read anything, and now I read it, and then I saw all of the different texts that are laid out and a little bit about each, and some of the biographical background, which makes it more interesting. I mean, that was perfect. Since then, I did read some, so I'm not after I read your book, I read some Benjamin. So he's known as a critic, right? And his best work was in interpretation.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, he once declared rather boldly and in a moment of unrestrained ambition to his friend Gershom Scholem that his goal in life was to become the foremost critic in German literature. I think he managed to achieve that posthumously, however, because during his life he had some difficulties with recognition, institutional and in publication. But yes, he excelled in a particular mode of interpretation that has really inspired the entire discipline of cultural studies and literary studies today. I think there's probably no more powerful and prestigious exemplar of literary and cultural interpretation than Benjamin. Others may dispute that fact, but it was amusing to me to see that in a very kind review of my book in the New Yorker, the author noted that when she was in graduate school, the professor in one of her classes said to the graduate students, "You know, you are permitted to read books by authors other than Walter Benjamin."
That's something.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really quite remarkable. And there's no real single text that he wrote, right? There's a lot of different things. Some of it is unfinished and came out much later, put together by other people, little snippets from different points in his life. Isn't that right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, he ranged very freely across different genres, and his greatest ambition in life was unfulfilled, which was the last work, the so-called Arcades Project or
Right.
Passagenwerk, which was a study of the Parisian arcades, also a study of the French poet Baudelaire and the entire 19th century. And that's a massive, incomplete archive of quotations, aperçus, facts quoted from other texts, scribbled down and 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 squirreled away into different files. And it remained incomplete. And after his death, it remained to Rolf Tiedemann, who was one of Theodor Adorno's students, to try to assemble all of these fragments into something manageable and publish an edited edition of the Passagenwerk, which was then translated with equal heroism into English. But it is not a unified text. So this exemplifies Benjamin's talent for collecting and experimenting and moving across different genres, so much so that some of his most intriguing work remains incomplete. Which is not to say he didn't complete other works. That there are indeed masterpieces, but they're of quite different character. There's Einbahnstraße, or One Way Street, which is an experiment in modernist montage, which portrays urban experience. There's his lovely portrait of his own childhood, Berlin childhood in the 19th century. There's the very enigmatic, difficult work of the study of the German Trauerspiel, or mourning play. These
And then
are
there's the
all really interesting works, but they do exemplify his peripatetic mind, his habit for crossing boundaries and thinking both as a philosopher and a literary critic and a cultural critic and critic of media, all at the same time.
one of the pieces I looked at was the article Kafka. And how did how did Kafka become important to Benjamin? I think it was published. It came out while he was Kafka's works came out in 1925, I think.
Yeah, so Kafka's works were coming out during Benjamin's own life, and as you probably know, they came out accompanied by some controversy. We know that
Mm.
Kafka's close friend from Prague, Max Brod, was asked by the author himself to burn all of his manuscripts, which Brod thankfully did not do. This is one of these wonderful cases where we can be grateful that the friend betrayed the author. And so some of the best known works by Kafka only appeared posthumously. And Benjamin was only one of a great many critics, philosophers, intellectuals in the 1920s who found all of Kafka's sometimes nightmarish and enigmatic texts truly inspiring, and they could find in them various sorts of things. I mean, Broad was quite famously attracted to what he believed to be the theological insights in
Mhm.
in Kafka's work. Benjamin and his friend and colleague Theodor Adorno were not enamored of Broad's interpretations and took Kafka's work in a different direction, perhaps with greater sensitivity to the polysemous, that is, the multivalent or multiple meanings of
Mhm.
found in Kafka's work. Yeah, sorry.
No, I found it fascinating, and it, uh, it certainly yes, it was the idea of a work of interpretation where you read it and you understand the text he's talking about better.
Yeah. Oh, I think that this is maybe one of Benjamin's greatest talents. He believed very strongly that the work of interpretation can complete and, in some respects, even surpass the work itself. And I think that's definitely true of his of this, wonderful essay on Kafka on the 10th anniversary of his death. It's a work which cracks open Kafka's texts in ways that Kafka's works really require.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, who would think you could actually, one of the things he points out in there is that he says that Kafka himself, quote, "took all conceivable precautions against interpretation."
Yeah.
But somehow he does. Just the way he, for example, I think you quoted the way he talks about how these low officials can suddenly rise up and assert this enormous power
Yeah.
in Kafka's work.
Yeah, I have to say this is one of those features of Kafka that I think closely resemble features of Benjamin's own life experience. Kafka belonged to this particular generation of German intellectuals born into a milieu that placed an emphasis on assimilation and bourgeois success. This was true of Kafka's family. And Kafka, of course, famously worked for an insurance company. And it was also true of Benjamin's family. His
Right.
father was a successful official in an auction house. And not all of these people were German Jews, but it was typical of this particular German Jewish generation that they were often the rebellious sons of bourgeois fathers
Mhm.
who would have liked nothing better than to see their sons follow in their footsteps. Kafka, as we know, would write during his off hours when he wasn't at the insurance company.
I
Uh,
didn't know that. That's interesting.
and Benjamin's father was deeply frustrated by his literary ambitions and saw Benjamin floundering at times and really wanted to force him back
Yeah.
into a more conventional mode of life. So I think there are felt affinities there when Benjamin is writing about Kafka and Kafka's life and the 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 gray nameless officials who become metaphysically ominous, powerful, and even menacing.
Yeah.
I think Benjamin was also describing some of his own conflicted relations with his own father, Emile.
Interesting. Right. I saw at one point you said that that his father said, "We'll only continue to support you if you get a job in a bank."
That's right.
Right.
That's right. And so Benjamin had serious conflicts with his father, so much so that at one point he and his young wife, Dora, at the time, had moved home, and they moved out very soon thereafter
Yeah.
because of real fights.
Right. So I kind of thought though that I was just thinking through it myself. You can certainly see. I tried to think. Okay, now if the father had known what would happen, that Benjamin would now be read so widely, he would have certainly supported him. But at the time, he really had no idea that his son was doing these great things. In fact, his son had failed at getting his habilitation, right?
Yes.
There was no reason for the father to think he had a genius son who was gonna change the world.
Yeah. Well, the judgment about the habilitation, of course, is one that is quite memorable, and many people today would say that it has left a mark of shame on the University of
Hmm.
Frankfurt and its faculty that has never been erased. This is a remark from Mike Jennings in Howard Island's biography. The truth is a little more complicated because the Tauschspiel book, his study of, this odd Baroque genre of mourning plays, is such a challenging book that many people are left in the same position as the judges at Frankfurt, who had a great deal of difficulty, and understandably so, when they tried to judge it according to conventional standards. It's just a terrifically complicated book. It's not it doesn't have a straightforward thesis. It's written in a very elliptical style. It's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating. But Benjamin did not make it easy on himself or on his academic judges. Now, the the truth then may be that Benjamin was ill-suited to be an academic,
Yeah,
because being an academic does typically mean hugging the shores of convention within rather standardized academic disciplines where certain norms of clarity and publication are expected. Maybe he was ill-suited to that life.
mm,
I tend to think, and I say this in the biography, that it was in a way, ironically, Benjamin's good fortune to find that he was untethered from the
certainly.
constrictions of an
Yeah,
academic life. But of course, this too would be a disappointment to those around him who expected him to follow the more well-traveled roads of success.
right.
You know, he after writing it, it was eventually published a few years later, and for its publication, he made things even more difficult for his readers by appending to it this very strange epistemo-critical prologue.
Right.
And I will confess, quite honestly, that the very first time I tried to read the Trauerspiel book, of course, I began as one would begin with the prologue, and I had no idea what it was saying. No idea whatsoever. And it's as if Benjamin ratcheted up the difficulty partly in a fit of pique, you know, against these judges, against Hans Cornelius and the others at Frankfurt who had demanded that he withdraw it. He simply made it all the more difficult on his readers. This is not to say it's not a brilliant book. I do think it's a brilliant book, but it's a book that demands a great deal of patience and concentration from his readers.
Well, he could certainly write both ways because that Kafka essay is a joy to read.
Oh, yes.
It's so clear, and I mean, I guess, well, he thought of the dissertation as more. He wasn't trying to. He wasn't reaching for a general audience. I guess he was reaching.
No, no, certainly not. But there are conventions of clarity even for an academic audience that he did not honor and perhaps did not wish to honor, and perhaps
Hmm.
rightly so. But yes, you're absolutely right. When he wanted to, he could write with the most engaging, imaginatively expansive prose. I mean, for me, one of the most delightful works that he ever published is his memoir of his own childhood, Berlin
Mm,
childhood around 1900, which he dedicated to his son Stefan, and it is a loving, in some ways, very nostalgic portrait of his own childhood during the first 10 years, 10, 15 years of his life.
tell us about that otter.
Oh, yeah.
It's so
Well,
wonderful.
well, yeah, I will confess that I have a particular love for that otter. So at the zoo, not far from Benjamin's family home, there was a particular pool of water that it had a sea otter. And Benjamin in his memoir, Berlin Childhood around 1900, describes this sea otter. And it's it's a really enchanted description. It's a description of a creature who lives in the water, sometimes comes to the surface, peeks up at the child gazing upon him. And Benjamin describes how in his childhood he imagined that all of the waterways collecting all of the rainwater across all of Berlin somehow converged upon this sea otter's dark pool. And you have there an image which is very important to Benjamin about how the dispersed urban environment nonetheless has subterranean meanings and connections that all flow into one thing. And then he elaborates further upon this with the idea that the sea otter, after momentarily rearing its head above the water, would dive down back to busy itself with its affairs below. And I found this particularly enchanting because I do think it captures something of Benjamin's own techniques. I mean, Benjamin himself is this sometimes rather lonely creature,
Yeah.
but someone who can dive down in and discover riches below. This is, of course, closely related to the image of pearl diving, which is an image that I borrow from Hannah Arendt's introductory essay in the first English language collection of Benjamin's work, Illuminations.
Right.
Arendt describes Benjamin's method as pearl diving, as diving into the water and finding resting from the oysters, their treasures, and bringing those pearls to the surface. So there's something about that sea otter, it seems to me, which was once again Benjamin's own very clever way of describing himself and describing his own method.
It does seem very much like what a child would imagine, and I probably imagined things like that before, but I don't remember them. It's kind of amazing that he could even remember all those memories.
Well, I think he had a very childlike mind,
Mm,
or a mind that was very alive to the experiences of his own childhood and of children in general. He had a large collection of children's books. He was also fascinated by children's toys, and there's a childlike habit of free association that one finds in all of his work. This may explain why he was so fascinated by the human capacity for mimesis, the human capacity for discerning similarity among things and between oneself and objects in the world. And he wrote a wonderful essay about the mimetic faculty, which which really does demonstrate that peculiar interest. And it became a theme that also preoccupied Adorno and Horkheimer in their work later on. There's an important place for mimesis in Dialectic of Enlightenment, a work, of course, that they wrote around the time of Benjamin's own death.
when so, eh, not being an academic, he made money by a few articles he had published and then translations, and I guess that was it. Those were the main sources, right? Translations and a few articles?
Well, so he earned money from various sources. Yes, there were fees for publication. There were fees from the sale of his books. There were a great many radio addresses that he gave
Oh, right.
in Berlin
Mm,
before he had to leave Berlin and the radio stations shut him out. And those were about 80 different, radio addresses on a whole variety of themes. But then there were moments when he was forced to ask friends and relations
mhm.
for some financial support. And finally, one of the major sources of support for him were the stipends he received from the Institute for Social Research,
Alright.
which was at that time directed by Max Horkheimer, and Benjamin received many of those. One one last source of funding should be mentioned, and it touches upon the Benjamin's own connections to Judaism. Gershom Scholem had moved to Jerusalem and wanted Benjamin to move to Palestine as well, and to do so, Benjamin was asked to learn Hebrew.
Right.
And Scholem arranged for Benjamin to even have a meeting with Rabbi Judah Magnus, who was by this point the rector at the newly founded Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And with Sholom's support, with Sholom's endorsement for this, Benjamin was provided with some funding in order to spend his time learning Hebrew.
Right.
He made some fitful, half-hearted efforts. We have a few postcards on which he wrote out Hebrew characters and a few Hebrew words. When he wrote to Sholem, he would, I think it's fair to say, exaggerate to the degree to which
Sure.
he was devoting himself to learning Hebrew, but never really followed through, which embittered Sholem a great deal. And at one point, it seems that this disagreement even strained their friendship and shut down communication for a little while. Benjamin continued to promise that he would pursue his Hebrew studies and would eventually visit Palestine, at least for a short while, perhaps as an experiment to see if he could move there permanently. But in fact, he never did. He never
Mhm.
even visited. And much to Sholem's consternation, it was fairly clear, I think, that Benjamin felt that his life as a European Jew was in Europe itself. This didn't deter him, however, from getting a little bit of financial
Yeah,
support for the project of learning Hebrew.
sure. I wondered whether he had the sense that when you when you refuse bourgeois respectability, you are kind of closer to something more vital, that you don't have that anesthetizing rhythm into your life, so that this was almost a choice?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, one of the themes that runs through Benjamin's entire life from his teen years onward is a certain fascination with ideas of cultural rebellion or
Mhm.
radical cultural change. The first movement that he was really a part of was the youth movement. Those there were various movements in Germany at the time that promoted the idea of cultural renewal and youth rebellion. And Benjamin had attended the Vickersdorf, this experimental school, which promoted many of the ideas of the youth movement. And Benjamin was particularly inspired by this charismatic young man who taught there,
Mhm.
um, named Weineken. And Benjamin found in Weineken a real sage who inspired him and gave him this idea that the youth could break from the desiccated bourgeois life of their mothers and fathers
Mhm.
and create a new culture in Central Europe. Weineken betrayed the youth movement, in Benjamin's opinion, when he endorsed World War One.
Well, geez, yeah. And
And Benjamin broke angrily from Weineken over that, but he remained attracted to the ideals of the youth movement and the ideals of cultural rebellion and a rejuvenation of German culture that he had found in the youth movement. And he was somewhat attracted to Zionism for the same reasons, though by no means a political nationalist who believed that the path for assimilated Jews like himself lay in Palestine. This didn't deter him, however, from having some sympathy for Eastern European Jews, and he thought that the future for Eastern European Jewry, uh, menaced by violent pogroms, perhaps lay in political Zionism. So sometimes it's said that he was a unrestrained opponent of political Zionism. For good or for ill, that's not actually the case.
right.
He seems to have had some sympathies with it. In general, however, in his mature years, this utopian sensibility, this sensibility of radical rebellion, prevented him really from ever feeling himself a full-throated advocate of any political movement.
Right.
He once described himself as a nihilist. And although some people have tried to claim him for Marxism, I think it's significant that he could never join the Communist Party. His understanding of Marxism was somewhat spotty.
Mhm.
And his romance with Marxism was really a romance, you might say, with a invention of his own imagination rather than the actual existing
Yeah.
communist movement that he witnessed when he had a brief and lonely winter in Moscow.
I thought that it was really difficult to read the parts about him trying to get his pieces approved by, I guess, or Adorno and others, and well, by not only his thesis committee or the people who would give him a habilitation, but even Marxists or members of the Frankfurt School who were criticizing him out from every direction. This is and also from his friend. It just seemed like he couldn't really write what he wanted. He kept being told, "You're not psychoanalytic enough. You're too psychoanalytic. You're not Marxist enough. You're too Marxist. You're not dialectical." Right? It was fairly difficult. He couldn't just do what he wanted. That's what it felt like to me.
Yeah, one does have the impression that Benjamin's best instincts were sometimes thwarted by those friends and colleagues who wished to recruit him for one particular doctrine
Mm,
or another. This is, I think, quite famously the case with the Institute for Social Research because Adorno and Horkheimer had a philosophical temperament that was indeed neo-Marxist, but it was mediated through philosophical sensibility that
mhm,
was in many respects different from Benjamin's own. So, on some occasions when Benjamin submitted manuscripts to the institute, hoping to secure their assent for publishing those manuscripts in the pages of their journal, the Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung, they read them with some disappointment and
mhm,
pushed him to modify the claims somewhat. Adorno was the one who would write Benjamin and charge Benjamin with being insufficiently dialectical,
mhm.
with having, for example, too straightforward a notion of how the economy relates to culture. This at one point, Adorno accused Benjamin of writing works that lay at the crossroads between magic and positivism. And if you know anything about the discourses of the Frankfurt School at the time, you realize what an extraordinarily wounding phrase that is.
Yeah,
Benjamin tried to defend himself, but the truth is his own talents weren't easily consonant with the philosophical disposition of the Frankfurt Institute, nor did they entirely fit the expectations of his friend Bertolt Brecht. Brecht, too, was a Marxist,
right.
but of a very different kind.
Alright.
And Adorno um,
Yes.
was no less satisfied to see Benjamin adopting some of the philosophemes, some of the philosophical themes that were found in Brecht's work. And Brecht, meanwhile, was displeased when Benjamin adopted some of the mannerisms of his Frankfurt colleagues, and Brecht was also displeased when Benjamin adapted some of the themes or invoked some of the sentiments of Gershom Scholem and Jewish mysticism.
Right.
So one gets the image in the end of poor Benjamin being pulled in various different directions
Absolutely.
by friends and colleagues who really didn't want to permit him to be himself. I think he was at his most original when he developed works that could not be easily classified
Mhm.
or enlisted in any one of these various movements, whether it be uh, movements in modern Jewish thought or Brechtian Marxism with its rather militant sensibility, or the more philosophically mediated neo-Marxism of the Frankfurt School. All of these, I think, produced some distortions in Benjamin's work, and Benjamin tried, sometimes rather desperately, to make himself to conform to their
Yeah,
expectations, but I
it did
think his
seem that
work
way.
was best. I think his work was best when he resisted those pressures.
Well, I read your description of the Arcades project. By the way, for the listeners, by arcade, we're talking about basically a hallway with light at the top and stores on either side,
Yeah, that's
right?
right. So you can still find these in Paris, and they're lovely to walk through. Some of them are dusty old places. Some of them have been cleaned up a great deal. They're found mostly in the central arrondissement of Paris. One is right near the old Bibliothèque Nationale on the Rue Richelieu, which is where Benjamin worked for many years after he moved to Paris. So he knew those arcades very well. Yeah, what they are is essentially so you have the traditional 8-story high Parisian apartment building, the bourgeois apartment buildings, those characteristic white
Mhm.
19th century apartment complexes. And on the first floor of those buildings, there are often shops. But there are also what are essentially alleyways or tunnels.
All right.
In many cases, these were formed by covering over alleyways with steel and glass so that light filters in from above. And then on the sides of these passages, these passages, you have vitrines, you have shop windows. And you still find these in Paris. There aren't a great many of them, but they're lovely to stroll through. And Benjamin seems to have decided that strolling through them was an experience that exemplified the entire experience of 19th century bourgeois modernity.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw that and then I thought, okay, I read the description, and so it has it's a montage, you would say, right? It's the method that he's using, and
Yeah,
it has a
I
lot
think
of
that's
quotations from other people in there, and then his own things, and I thought, "Oh, this I'm not gonna like this. I need to know what's going on." But I bought it, and I took it home to Newton, and I just figured I'd start reading it, and I was transfixed. I couldn't I couldn't put it down. It was great.
yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
really you who would have thought that a book about the arcades would be so interesting?
Yeah, well, I mean, Benjamin excelled in this. I mean, taking, say, some apparently minor or marginal detail in life experience and exploding it until something about our entire epoch is
Right.
revealed, and that's definitely what he did with the experience of the arcades. Now, what he thought I think you mentioned montage, so I think this is very important to understand. What he thought we find in the arcades is the fragmented and distracted nature of modern urban experience. When one strolls through an arcade or when one strolls along the Parisian street more generally, we find ourselves in a state of distraction where experience is not unified. Experience is instead fragmented into a bunch of, let's say, montage-like moments that don't all cohere, and yet nonetheless, that state of distraction, that montage-like fragmented experience tells us something about the nature of modern commodified life. I mean, you
Mhm.
when you stroll through the Passage, you are looking at commodities in the vitrines in shop windows on either side. And Benjamin thought that this is typical of being a modern individual in a commodified world.
This reminds me the other I didn't really know this word before I read your book, and now I'm fascinated by it, the word flaneur. That comes from his now, was he translating Baudelaire? Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, he translated a great number of
Okay.
Baudelaire's poems and wrote a marvelous essay, The Task of the Translator, which speaks about his skills in translation. He didn't translate only Baudelaire, I should point out. He also translated, for example, Proust,
Proust, right.
and he translated quite a lot of Proust's multi-volume masterpiece, La
Yeah.
Recherche du Temps Perdu. So Benjamin was very skilled in translation. He was fascinated by Baudelaire, and he was especially fascinated by Paris Spleen and Les Fleurs du Mal, um, Baudelaire's collection of poems describing Parisian life and all of the characters in Paris, the drunkard, the rag picker, the prostitute. Benjamin found all of these characters very interesting And the chiffonnier, the rag picker from Baudelaire became for Benjamin a particularly poignant illustration of his own habits of collecting.
You're right. Right.
Collecting urban experience, collecting aperçus and quotations. This was the this was Baudelaire's method of poetry, and it became, in a way,
Mm,
Benjamin's method of interpretation in general.
mhm. And so
So the
what about
do you wanted to know about the flaneur
yes,
for
please.
so flânerie is we could simply translate as strolling,
Okay.
and a flaneur is someone who strolls along in urban space, perhaps with no particular goal in mind. Um, they're simply randomly making their way this way and that along the sidewalk, for example. And Baudelaire's image of the flaneur, Baudelaire himself, we should say, was a great flaneur, and Baudelaire's image of the flaneur became, in some ways, a heroic image for
Mm,
Benjamin himself, who
right.
was a great wanderer and a poet of urban experience.
Here, 2 quotes I found in reading the Arcades Project. This is Benjamin. He says, "The idleness of the flaneur is a demonstration against the division of labor." Then another is, "Basic to flânerie is the idea that the fruits of idleness are more precious than the fruits of labor. The flaneur, as is well known, makes," scare quotes, "studies." This is almost impossible for me to imagine doing. I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm this neoliberal subject who needs to have a purpose and do things, but it was really striking.
Yeah, well, I think that Benjamin there is once again describing his own life experience
Mhm.
as someone who had great ambitions, but often left those ambitions half complete. The flaneur, in his idleness, embodies, you might say, a kind of resistance to what later Frankfurters would call the performance imperative, right? To the demand that we fulfill the task at hand,
Yes.
that we work ourselves as hard as possible upon some narrowly confined project. And
Yes.
to resist the division of labor is to resist that thought about what it is to be, as you said, a good neoliberal subject.
Yeah. What amazing.
Yeah.
Uh, now,
I have to say the economy has by our times, closed down most of the spaces for that kind of freedom, for that kind of directionless thinking, for that kind of directionless creativity.
right.
And I think one reason why Benjamin may be so appealing to people today is because he holds open an ideal which is nearly vanishing. I mean, the idea of the undisciplined intellectual, of the intellectual who can wander from task to task and think creatively about a great variety of projects, has become in our own day the damning image of the dilettante that
Right.
no academic is supposed to be, that no intellectual, is permitted to be.
Or free
Dile
spirit is a derogatory term, right?
that's right, that's right. And in Benjamin's time, the sociologist Karl Mannheim spoke of freischwebende Intelligenz, of the free-floating intellectual. Benjamin was, I think, really a free-floating intellectual, or to use the Yiddish term, a Luftmensch, someone who really is floating above the ground,
Mm.
or at least he wanted to be. Of course, financial precarity often brought him down despite his best efforts.
Brought him down, but it also enabled him to be closer to
Absolutely. I would say both at once, yeah.
right. Now you had a lot of things you had to pare down a lot. I'm sure there was a lot that you wanted to include that you didn't. I One of the things that you did include was his so I know now that the story of his death is well known, but I didn't actually know it. But before we get to that, it was kind of amazing that he's trying to leave occupied France, and his party takes a dry run, a rehearsal the day before, and they get to where they're gonna stop, and he says, "No, they had to go through the woods to keep away from the officials and to go to Spain, and he says, "I'll just stay here overnight in the woods," and insisted on this. I found that I don't know, d I found it really puzzling, and you included it. I wondered what it meant to you or
Well, okay, so one must remember that he was born in 1892, and
Mhm,
so by 1940, he was 48 years old. Now that's relatively young, but he had lived a rather sedentary life.
mhm.
He wasn't obese by any means, but he had grown heavy. He had a heart condition, and
Okay.
this trip was this trip, the first tentative trip to scout out the path was challenging for him. He had to stop every so often while
Okay.
making this trip, and it was rocky, quite exposed and uphill. So when they reached the point at the top where they would turn back after this first tentative, he said he would just stay there, that he didn't wanna make the return trip and then make the genuine journey and then crossing the border. He didn't wanna make that twice.
Mhm.
Given his heart condition, I think it's, not surprising that he thought
Okay.
he should just stay there overnight. Now there is something very odd about it. It's once again this image of a man who feels so so hopeless, so challenged that he simply can't bring himself to undertake this journey twice. But I think his health condition was bad enough, and he had to stop very, very frequently
Mhm. Okay.
during this uphill, trip.
So, and I guess the last thing, we're running out of time, but you say that I really liked the way you worked with time here. It was beautiful, and leave him at a spot where he's looking at the Mediterranean, and who knows what's gonna happen. There was one thing that puzzled me, though, because, you know, you say no man's death defines his life. We shouldn't let his death take away our esteem for what he did. But if you look at, of course, if if you look at the way he handled himself facing this situation, it was very admirable as far as I could tell. He
Mm,
was self-possessed. He knew what he was going to do and what he wasn't. He was prepared. He had morphine.
mm.
He seemed to face it, this, Kafkaesque situation where this official comes and says, "Oh, no, the rules have changed." He seemed to handle it in an admirable way.
Yeah, I don't know whether I can comment on his personal sensibility at the time. I think he took that morphine in a moment of despair,
Oh, okay.
believing quite reasonably that having been turned back at the border, they would be arrested, and eventually he would probably end up with the Gestapo. So I think the alternative was far more terrifying than simply taking charge and taking his own life. I don't know whether I would call it admirable, but just a reasonable choice,
Mm,
given how terrible it might have been for him had he fallen into the hands of, uh,
right.
the authorities. But I'm glad that you liked how I played with the timing there. I really did want to insist that we honor Benjamin's own principle, that we brush history against the grain and that we don't permit the victors the last word. And by telling the story of his death at the beginning and then putting it aside, I hope to honor that basic dictum of Benjamin's, that the victors should not be permitted the last word. He wanted to trouble linear temporality. That's last most important instructions in his so-called theses on the philosophy of history. And so I thought it was a way of honoring those instructions that I would leave him at a moment of possibility,
Yeah.
sitting at the blue-green waters of the Mediterranean. And as I say, that were flashing in the sun like a promise of freedom.
Yeah. No, I literally gave me goosebumps when I read it. Respect and admiration for that. The book is Walter Benjamin. Subtitle is The Pearl Diver. Peter E. Gordon. Thank you so much for talking to me today.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you, August.